3 million years ago, North and South America were disconnected from each other. Currents flowed between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans pretty freely. But about 2.8 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama formed, and the flow was cut off. As a result, currents that flowed from the Gulf of Mexico up toward Greenland strengthened greatly. And over the next 250,000 years, the Earth's climate shifted from the relatively calm climate of the Pliocene to the colder and much larger fluctuations of the Pleistocene. In this new epoch, climate in the northern hemisphere started to oscillate strongly on regular cycles that were related to the Earth's axial tilt. Creatures living on land experienced periods of warmth and abundant rainfall that would last 10 to 15,000 years, and they would be followed by periods of cool weather and drought that would last just as long. During these cooler, drier periods, there would also be extreme glaciation around the Arctic Circle, leading them to be called ice ages. The line of primates that became our ancestors, the Australopithecines, split from the rest of the great apes somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago. But it was during the Pleistocene, with its intense and unforgiving climate swings, that the hominids that became our ancestors evolved and eventually became us. But here's the thing. It almost didn't happen. About 1.2 million years ago, the climate shifts of the Pleistocene became much more pronounced, with ice ages becoming much colder, much drier, and lasting 2 to 3 times longer. And the warm periods were even hotter. These swings put immense selection pressure on every living organism. This period became known as the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, and it drove hominid populations to starvation, cannibalism, and the very brink of extinction. It's been known for decades that hominid populations living at this time were greatly depleted in the African savanna. But just how close they brushed with extinction has been a matter of debate. This study, which was published a few weeks ago, analyzed elements of the human genome, tracing their lineage back nearly 1.5 million years. And what they discovered about the apocalypse our ancestors endured is breathtaking. I want to talk about this study and what the researchers found. Along the way, we're going to discuss the climate of the Pleistocene and the dynamics of the Earth's orbit and axial tilt that influenced it. We're going to touch on our species family tree and the hominids that existed 1.2 million years ago. And we'll talk about the Mid-Pleistocene Transition and how it affected hominid populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia. Finally, I want to discuss the aftermath of all this and some of the things that are still unknown. There are a lot of mysteries in our human story, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface. So let's get into it. I'm Cameron, and this is my channel. Welcome to the Sexy Universe. As I mentioned earlier, the Pleistocene had much longer and more pronounced oscillations than the Pliocene that came before it. And while changes in ocean currents allowed these changes to take place, they were ultimately driven by the amount of energy from the sun that was hitting the Earth's surface, particularly in the northern hemisphere. These changes are known as Milankovich cycles. Milutin Milankovich was a Serbian civil engineer. Later in his career, he transitioned to doing research, particularly in celestial mechanics and theoretical physics. He applied mathematics to meteorological data to try to find patterns, and he was able to discern cycles in the rise and fall of insolation. Insolation is the amount of solar energy that's hitting the Earth. At the time, he was able to find 3 separate cycles. And even though several other cycles have been found over the last 100 years or so, the 3 he found are still the most important. That's what I want to talk about here. The first of these cycles is the eccentricity of Earth's orbit. It cycles between being an almost perfect circle to a very, very slightly eccentric ellipse. And these changes run on a 100,000-year cycle. And as a result, when the orbit is more elliptical, there's greater distance between the Earth and the Sun at different times of the year. And obviously, this would have a big effect on the Earth's temperature. The second cycle is precession of the Earth's orbit. So if this ball of Play-Doh represents the Earth, we can use this mechanical pencil to represent the Earth's axis. The Earth's axis is slightly tilted relative to the Sun, and the precession of the Earth's orbit refers to how that tilt wobbles. And the effect this has is basically changing which star is the astronomical North Star. Right now we're pointed at Polaris, but 12,000 years from now, we'll be pointed toward Vega. And that eccentricity cycle takes about 25,700 years. A third Milankovich cycle is obliquity. Obliquity refers to the angle at which the Earth is tilted. At its maximum angle, the Earth is tilted 24.5 degrees, and at its minimum, it's at 22.1 degrees. The reason precession and obliquity are important is because the angle of the Earth's tilt affects the amount of sunlight that's hitting the northern hemisphere. Earth's northern hemisphere has more land than the southern hemisphere does, and as a result, it absorbs more radiation from the sun. So at times when the northern hemisphere is receiving more sunlight, the entire planet warms. So we have the period of changes in eccentricity, which is 100,000 years. We have the period of wobble, which is 25,700 years. And we have the period of changes in the angle of the tilt itself, which is 41,000 years. And while the period of these cycles may have changed over time, it's safe to say that cycles like this have existed for as long as the Earth has existed. This graph shows levels of the heavy oxygen isotope oxygen-18 in sediments along the African coast. Most oxygen atoms have an atomic weight of 16 because there are 8 protons and 8 neutrons. However, oxygen atoms can also be stable with 10 neutrons. Water molecules have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. So water molecules that have an oxygen-18 atom are heavier than water molecules that have an oxygen-16 atom. And as a result, those slightly lighter molecules are more likely to evaporate at any given time. And when water evaporates from the oceans, it eventually comes down as rainfall. When the Earth's temperatures are lower, a lot more of that rainfall or snowfall attaches onto glaciers and freezes. And as a result, the overall amount of oxygen-16 in the ocean declines a little bit. And that means the concentration of oxygen-18 increases. Along every coastline on Earth, sand, dust, and other particles from land make their way into the ocean. Over time, they settle and form sediments, and some water molecules get trapped within those sediments. So during times when the Earth is cooler, more oxygen-18 gets trapped within those sediments. So by looking at those levels, we can see whether the Earth was in a warmer phase or a colder phase. This graph is set up so when oxygen-18 levels in the sediments are higher, the line goes lower on the graph. And that way it's more obvious when temperatures are rising or falling. So you'll notice on this graph that during the Pliocene, which came before the Pleistocene, temperatures are both warmer and they're not as variable. And the first of our tool-using semi-bipedal ancestors, the Australopithecines, like Lucy, showed up during the Pliocene epoch. An early hominid, which has been called Kenyanthropus, also showed up during this time. And Kenyanthropus was the first hominid to use stone tools. The tools were obsidian flakes, mainly used for butchering animals, and hand axes that were used to crack nuts and split open bones. The tools were excavated on the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, and they're about 3.3 million years old. Not much is known about the Kenyanthropus who manufactured and used them, but hopefully more will be discovered as time goes on. During the Pleistocene, as this data shows, periods of glaciation got intense and lasted a lot longer, and they ran on 41,000-year cycles, corresponding to changes in the Earth's axial tilt, obliquity. So there were periods of hot weather with heavy rainfall that could last more than 10,000 years, and they would be followed by ice ages that could last just as long. Elizabeth Verba studied speciation trends in Africa during the Pleistocene. And this graph shows patterns of bovid speciation, so animals like buffalo, cattle, goats, and antelope. The dashed curve shows what the rate of plant species turnover would be in the absence of climate swings. And so we can see that basically that vegetation would turn over every 32,000 years. And if the vegetation is turning over, we would expect animal species to do the same. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see extended periods where more and more species show up, and these would correspond to warm periods. And during periods of cold, which would also include a lot of drought, we can see that a lot of these species go extinct. And these dynamics weren't just happening in Africa. There's been extensive research done on the Loess Plateau in China. and it's because it has high levels of silt and these very interesting erosion dynamics that are similar to what we see in the Badlands here in the US. This paper talks about the dental patterns of hoofed animals in the Mediterranean during the Pleistocene, and the researchers found that during extended periods of drought, species in the area developed larger molars over generations, and that those molars showed a lot more wear. It implies that during times of drought, their diet shifted over to rougher forage that was more difficult to chew, so more roots and twigs. And this sheds some light on the divergence we see between Australopithecine and Kenyanthropus lines of evolution during the Pleistocene. On the one hand, with the Australopithecines, we have this group of somewhat hominid-like but also very ape-like animals. And they're mostly bipedal, and they have much larger brains than the other great apes. But instead of going heavily into tool use, they developed molars 4 times the size of ours and huge jaws and chewing muscles. The fossils we found of the latest of this line, Paranthropus robustus and Paranthropus boisei, show the kind of wear on their teeth that we would expect to find in animals that were eating a lot of fruit. So during periods of abundance, they like to eat the same sweet, soft foods we do. But physically, they were built for digging in the ground, pulling branches, and chewing every last bit of nutrition out of them. And it's possible that they were also able to get nutrition from scavenging by chewing hides and bones if necessary. So during times of drought and scarcity, we can be fairly sure they would have fallen back on that. And this is how the Australopithecines evolved during the first half of the Pleistocene. And on the other side of this tree is the hominids, who were still very ape-like, but were also developing the kind of features you would expect to see on archaic humans. And they developed much larger brain cases and got better at using tools and carrying things as well. Their bodies grew taller and larger, which also made them better at hunting and scaring off other predators. And it looks like their group sizes got larger as well. A lot of this is driven by the demands of bipedal locomotion. Walking upright forced the pelvic gap to have to shrink. This is because the organs, which are held up by the abdominal wall in a 4-legged animal, instead have to be held up by the pelvic floor in bipedal animals. And because of this, infants had to be born at much earlier developmental stages to be able to pass through the birth canal. And larger groups are better at providing for the needs of infants and new mothers. By the time we get to the Mid-Pleistocene Transition 1.2 million years ago, we basically have 2 species of hominids, Homo erectus and Homo antecessor. Homo erectus had spread from Africa to Europe and Asia, and Homo antecessor, as far as we know, was only found in Western Europe. But at this point, there was another climate transition, and it was even more severe than the first. Once again, looking at our graph of Benthic Oxygen-18 deposits, we can see that 1.2 million years ago, the cycles started getting longer and deeper. And what's going on is they were changing from 41,000 year cycles that are associated with the Earth's tilt to 100,000 year cycles, which are associated with the Earth's eccentricity. So hot spells got hotter, floods got more extreme, droughts got drier, and glaciers extended for much longer and got much thicker. And sometimes those glaciers would even cover almost all of Europe, half of North America, and most of Northern Asia. Everything got more extreme, which means there was even more pressure on species to try to survive. And the results of all this are very evident in Africa. First of all, we don't find any Australopithecus or Paranthropus remains that are younger than 1 million years old. So we know that during this transition, they were wiped out. Most of them probably starved. A large number of them were certainly eaten by other predators, including our hominid ancestors. There's also a hominid fossil gap in Africa, where only a handful of fossils have been found that date between 950,000 years ago and 700,000 years ago. So this major die-off is known as the 0.9 million year ago event. Homo antecessor existed in Europe at the time. They were first discovered in 1976 and characterized as a new species in 1997. And it was thought at the time that this archaic species was the most likely progenitor of us, of Homo sapiens. And this was thought because they had relatively flat facial features and small brow ridges. The youngest remains that have been found are 800,000 years old, and most of those fossils have very strong evidence of butchering, indicating that the meat was cut off of them with the intent of eating it. And that includes these fossils, which are the remains of a young girl, the girl of Gran Dolina. DNA doesn't last long enough to be studied in fossils that are this old. However, there's a branch of study called paleoproteomics, which analyzes the structure of ancient proteins using mass spectrometry. And by knowing the structure of these proteins, we can figure out the structure of the DNA they came from. And what these analyses have proved is that Homo antecessor could not have been the progenitor of Homo sapiens. So we can safely say that entire line died out during the Mid-Pleistocene Transition. Homo erectus populations vanished from Africa, though they continued to exist in Europe and Asia. The last of this species didn't die out until almost 200,000 years ago. So it's been known for decades that our ancestors, the hominids, nearly died out during this event. But just how close they came hasn't been known. That's what the authors of this study tried to find out. What they looked at was something that's called the site frequency spectrum. It's also known as the allele frequency spectrum. And the genetic data was derived from 3,154 individuals. These individuals were grouped into 10 African and 40 non-African populations. I'd like to quickly explain what a site frequency spectrum is. Human chromosomes contain genes. Each gene codes for a single protein. The genes have variations, and those variations are called alleles. The researchers selected a subset of alleles that are less prone to social selection, and they also discarded rare and high-frequency mutations. So they looked to get a stable, random set of data that was mostly impacted by natural selection. They put these through a coalescent algorithm that was specifically developed for this research. Genes mutate slowly over time. So over long periods of time, we can expect that the set of alleles, the set of variations in any gene, will get larger. However, if there's a major die-off or selection event, the number of variations within that set will decrease. A coalescent algorithm looks backward in time to see how one particular gene could have produced many variations of itself over many generations. For this study, they assumed that a generation was 24 years, and that the mutation rate for these sets of genes is 1 in 1.2 billion per generation. By running this analysis, they were able to track the size and genetic variation of human ancestral breeding populations going back 1.5 million years. The model found a population loss that started 1.2 million years ago and severely bottlenecked 920,000 years ago. That bottleneck lasted 117,000 years. At the beginning of that bottleneck, the population of our ancestors was 98,130. During the bottleneck, the maximum possible population of our ancestors was 1,280 breeding individuals. The analysis can't tell us the exact size of the species population. There may have been other individuals who were not reproducing. But in a situation of extreme scarcity, it's not very likely that there were very many children or older people. The group of hominids that were our ancestors lived in such an extreme environment that the maximum population was less than 1,300 individuals, and this situation lasted for 117,000 years. During that time period, any natural disaster, any new disease, could have wiped that population out completely. During that time, more than 65% of the genetic diversity of our ancestors was lost. And in fact, the loss of genetic diversity was so severe that an entire chromosome appears to have vanished. And this time period coincides with the lowest surface ocean temperatures and the lowest rainfall rates of that whole transition period. Fossils became more abundant after about 750,000 years ago, and those that have been found most closely resemble Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis fossils were originally found near Heidelberg, Germany, but they've also been found in other locations in Europe. Fossils found in Africa, such as the Broken Hill cranium in Kabwe, Zambia, are also thought to be from this species. It's the only fossil found in Africa for several 100,000 years, between the 0.9 million year ago event and the emergence of Homo sapiens. But here's another thing. The bottleneck doesn't appear to have ended because of changes in the climate, even though the climate became less brutal. It's not believed that changes in climate are what allowed populations to recover. Instead, that population recovery corresponds to control of fire, which appears to have happened around 800,000 years ago. Homo Heidelbergensis was followed by the Neanderthals, Denisovans, Rudenti, and Homo sapiens. And in the harsh environment of the late Pleistocene, only modern humans survived. There are still many things that are unknown. While Homo heidelbergensis is the only candidate we have for our nearest progenitor, it's not entirely clear that they are. And while it's believed that Neanderthals evolved from them, that's not certain either. There's currently a Neanderthal genome project which is working to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome. And the field of paleoproteomics may give us some more insight into how we're related to Homo heidelbergensis. It's also not known what caused the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, though there are modeling studies of our Earth's core and mantle that may provide some insight. And with new discoveries being made every few years, it's likely we're going to get more and more insight into our hominid family tree and the Australopithecines that came before us. We're in a golden age of scientific discovery, and it's a great time to be alive. I believe the ideal life is a non-stop process of learning and growing. Thanks for learning and growing with me. I want to hear what you have to say, so please leave your thoughts and information you'd like to share in the comments section below. And hit the like and subscribe buttons on your way out. Stay on your game, and I'll see you next time on The Sexy Universe.